I'm always eager to see the new settings and characters and what kinds of scenarios I will be experiencing in this visual novel that I have never read before. I feel like the early introductory portions of a visual novel are really important. While I have played a handful of visual novels that like quote unquote get good after several dozens of hours of playing, in the majority of times I feel like a VN really has to like land its beginning portions to like hook me and get me invested to where I'm going to want to see that VN all the way to completion. And so today I wanted to kind of talk about maybe a couple examples of VNs that have like really good introductory portions and kind of get you, the reader, into the mindset of what that story is going to be entailing, while at the same time hooking you and making you feel invested. And then at the same time, maybe talking about an example that maybe is less on that side. I wouldn't say is really bad, but at the same time, maybe gave me what I would say is the standard for myself as for how long I'm going to go ahead and play a specific VN for before I really like can tell when that VN is going to be something that I'm going to enjoy. Pretty like weird and broad topic, but one that I wanted to talk about. So let's get into it. Starting us off with an example of a visual novel that has like a pretty good introductory portion, I would say, is Wonderful Everyday Down the Rabbit Hole, otherwise known as Tsubihime. Now disregarding all of the memes that have kind of sprouted about around Tsubihime as of lately, I think Wonderful Everyday is pretty good in that when you start the game, the main character is sitting on one of the rooftops at their school, smoking a cigarette while looking into the sky. And it's something that's like not really too like engaging. It's just like some standard ordinary action. But I feel like the way that it's worded, along with all of the like the vibes that are provided through all of its visuals and audio cues, makes you feel like it's this sort of like bigger, broader story. It prepares you, the reader, for this sort of like different experience. It prepares you for the genre of the visual novel that it is, and that you might have some moments throughout reading Tsubihime that are going to confuse you and where you aren't necessarily going to be able to follow along with everything that's happening, but also kind of like puts you into the mood of making you feel like I should probably be paying attention rather than just kind of going along and feeling like this is going to be your everyday average VN. So I would say Wonderful Everyday, aka Tsubihime, has a pretty good introductory portion that like prepares you, the reader, for the experience throughout the rest of the visual novel, while at the same time the quality within the artwork and the music that plays really does like kind of engage you and be like, whoa, this is going to be something that is really cool. Now, one example I wanted to bring up that I feel like as I've read more and more visual novels, I've become far more patient. When I started out reading VNs, I felt like I read a lot of those like very brief VNs that are maybe like 6 hours long, like 3 hours long, stuff like Planetarian, stuff like Doki Doki Literature Club. And then as I was kind of reading more, I feel like I never really wanted to step outside of the range of like 20 something hour visual novels, because I feel like I maybe didn't have as much like patience towards some of the like really slow burn VNs. And that sort of like patience was shown pretty like prevalently through the first couple of VNs that I read, where I had some games that I was like booting them up. I played it for like maybe 10-15 minutes and then closed out of the game, didn't come back to it until like significantly later down the line. And for me, one thing that I had kind of ended up finding as I would go back to some of these visual novels during my earlier portions was that how within like anime there is this sort of like agreed upon rule of watching 3 episodes out of an anime before you can decide on whether it's going to be something that you personally would enjoy. I ended up finding that within the example of Karawa Shoujo, which is a free visual novel, by the way, I had like no actual investment as far as, paying for it and feeling like I needed to get my money's worth out of it. I ended up finding that for me, what kind of hooked me was that once I got to the 25-minute mark, don't ask why it's not 30 minutes. I think it literally is that I had kind of like marked it as like, oh, it takes me 25 minutes before I was like engaged in the world of Karawa Shoujo, because I feel like Karawa Shoujo kind of has this like early introductory portion that gives you some like background as to what the main character's background is and how they have this sort of like health problem and why that ends up like being relevant to how the main character finds himself within the high school of Karawa Shoujo, where you're there for the people that have some sort of like disability. And to me, I almost feel like having that at like the very first thing you're going to experience with Karawa Shoujo kind of drew me out of it, because it's like we're trauma dumping for a character that I have no personal connection to whatsoever. But by the time that at that 25-minute mark, and I was finally within the high school of Karawa Shoujo and having the like character interaction, that was when I was like, okay, this is something that I could see myself reading more of, and ended up reading it all the way through. So that was an example of maybe where I wouldn't say Karawa Shoujo has a bad introductory portion, but is maybe something to where I feel like for me, it kind of established within my mind of this like self-imposed rule for myself of how I mentioned earlier in the video, where there's a couple of VNs that have like a lot of word of mouth of people saying that it's really, really good, but that it gets good once you played for several hours. I feel like for me, a majority of the time, I can kind of determine if it's a visual novel that I'm going to really enjoy by the time that I hit that 25-minute mark. And so like one other example was that I kind of didn't really mess with Clannad early on. The first introductory portion of Clannad is kind of the same deal, where you get this sort of like trauma dumping of, oh, here's the main character. He's a sort of like outcast that is like a troublemaker and has like a broken family and all this other stuff. And you're like, okay, well, why should I care? Same deal, once I got 25 minutes into Clannad, that was when something just kind of like connected for me to where I was like, okay, yeah, this is something that I could see myself really enjoying reading. Now taking that example of Karawa Shoujo, and I guess also Clannad, and being like, okay, well, how can we do trauma dumping right, and kind of do it to where we get the backstory of the main character within the earlier portions of the visual novel, while at the same time maybe not being too invasive, is going to be within the example of an untranslated visual novel that I read last year, being Clear, to where I feel like within a lot of visual novels you kind of have that like early setup of how do we introduce a main character, and a lot of the times there's a lot of VNs that are like, oh, we're some character that is like moving and transitioning over to like either some new town, some like new school or whatever. And Clear does that. We get a little bit of that information of why the protagonist has gone ahead and moved away from where they previously lived and is moving into this island that they apparently used to live on several years back. But the way that it's kind of done is kind of like, I feel like flows a little bit better. The very first portion of Clear has you in this sort of like, maybe kind of like close to Tsubihime, where you have this sort of like magical moment of you're seeing two characters standing on a hill talking about some like random things that you have no idea as to like what exactly is going on. You see some sort of like magic system that pops up and you're questioning as to like what exactly is this story about. But then as you get out of that scene, you end up getting to that like introductory portion of showing what the motives of the main character are, and is done in a way that is less invasive, I feel like, to me, to where you're just sitting in a bus and pondering some thoughts as you are on this journey, making your way to the island. It doesn't take up too much time. The main character is kind of just thinking about how, okay, I got into a fight at my old school, and you get to see a little bit of the baggage that the main character has. They kind of very like quickly hit you with the information that the main character is a vampire, and so you get that little bit of like, oh, okay, so there is maybe more of this like magic system. It's not your like everyday story. You have some of that more like magical elements of vampires as well, but they don't drag on it too much. And by the time that you get off the bus, you have at least a little bit of information as to the motives of the main character, but you haven't had everything dumped on you all at once within your like first 20 minutes of reading. And then I think another thing that kind of flows pretty well into that is that once you get off the bus and you start to kind of like navigate your way to the house that you're going to settle up in for the remainder of the story of Clear, you get that little bit of familiarity, even though you, the reader, have never like experienced the story to begin with, in that as the main character is apparently returning back to this island, you get this scene where a childhood friend is coming down off of this tram to meet up with you. And it kind of makes you feel a little bit more energetic, because while you've had all this like sort of information dumped on you, you're able to then kind of like flush that out of your system and get into those like character interactions of being able to like encounter somebody that the main character knows, but at least for you, the reader, you don't. But because of the fact that there's like this like year-long gap, it doesn't feel like there's too much of like a gap as for like, does it feel wrong that the main character is talking to this one character in a pretty like familiar tone. And I think in a way too, as like with some other VNs that I've read, where you do have it to where you're like going into a brand new location at the start of a VN, and almost like you can kind of tell the vibes of like how much is based off of the fact of, is there a character waiting for you once you arrive, compared to is there not a character. And it kind of sets up this like feeling of like, okay, is this story going to be more of this like sense of loneliness, or is this story going to be one filled with hope? And so I think within Clear, it gives you more of that like energetic vibe because of the fact that you have a character that is wanting to meet you as soon as you arrive in your early portions of the visual novel. But yeah, it's a pretty like weird topic for a video, but one that I wanted to talk about because, like I said in the beginning of the video, I feel like as I finish a visual novel, I always am like super excited to go ahead and see what new experiences I'm going to have in the visual novel to follow. And I feel like that early introductory portion, and what I have personally decided on being that first 25 minutes of a visual novel, is some of the most like crucial and important parts of a VN overall, and is something that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I've been Wave, and I will see you next time.